Sounds like they're going to start the meeting.
Okay, everybody, I think we're ready to start. Can you all, I hope you can all see and hear me.
Yep.
I'm Peggy Lauber, president of North Fork Audubon. And so John Holzapfel, who is giving our program tonight, our wonderful naturalist and former science teacher. You'll see what a great teacher he is when you watch this program. He approached me and told me that he had done a program on Roy Latham and George Rossum for the Orient Historical Society. And I jumped on it and said, please, you must do this program for us, because nothing could be more near and dear to our hearts than Roy Latham, for whom our Nature Center was named in 2019, and for which we're very grateful to the Latham family for working with us and getting that accomplished through Suffolk County. And
this is a better picture.
And also, and you know what? I'm going to mute everybody. Okay. So, and also George Rossum, who 10 years ago encouraged me to come to North Fork Audubon programs. It was really George who inspired me to get involved with North Fork Audubon. And George was a longtime Audubon member. And of course, we're going to hear all about him tonight. But also, I loved nothing more. My husband and I would plan our morning walks during the times of year when George was doing his mist nets at Dam Pond. And we would always try to get there in time to see George and talk to him about what was going on. And he was just such a wonderful teacher and mentor to me. And there's several members of his family tonight, and we're so glad you could all join us. And we hope we'll hear some input from you all as well. And I'm going to hand it over to John now. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Audubon, for North Fork Audubon, for inviting me. You're all familiar with the Little Red House, and I'm going to talk about two Orient naturalists. As Peggy said, I gave this for the Historical Society, and both of these people lived in Orient much of their lives, Roy for his whole life. First, we're going to talk about George Rossum. He was a bird and naturalist. George graduated from the Academy and Hobart College. And the reason I mention that is that it was at Hobart that George first began banding his birds in the early 20s with his biology professor on Seneca Lake. That was the starting point for his lifelong career in banding. He married, moved out here, and in the late 50s, realizing that the winters were long around here, George Rossum and his father-in-law decided to start a mail order business instrumental in building Preston's from a simple local marine hardware store into an internationally known mail order business. That became, as it says here, they were relative pioneers in the mail order business. When you go back at that time, it wasn't as common as it is now. Their business grew, shipping marine-themed prints and other artwork, gifts, and decorative items worldwide. I always remember reading in the Suffolk Times that the presidential candidate, Ross Perot, supposedly flew in all the way from Texas just to get up here to go to Preston's and buy certain things. So they were well known throughout the country and the world. George was a sailor, and as a result of that, he was a member of the Shelter Island Yacht Club, the Orient Yacht Club, the Chinese Yacht Club, and the Eastern Long Island Yachting Association. As a point, he served as Commodore of each of those at one time or another. Just to give you an idea of what everybody else thought of him, he became Commodore of those yacht clubs. He was also a director of the North Fork Bank, an honored founding member of the East End Seaport Museum, and he was very involved in rebuilding of the bug light. Now, deep in Moore's Woods in Greenport and out along the banks of Dam Pond, George Rossum spent nearly 2 decades meticulously documenting the history of nesting and migratory birds. Some of you might not be familiar, many of you will be, but this is Moore's Woods. Just for, let me go back here. This is the high school, the little red dot, the main road coming down here. And this is the sewage plant for Greenport, and this is Moore's Woods. This history of Moore's Woods comes from another naturalist by the name of Paul Stoutenberg. This was in one of his columns, and I just used it to give you some background if you're not familiar. Moore's Woods was given to the Moore family in 1640 by a grant from King James. Around 1870, Mr. William Moore decided to drain Silver Lake, as around this time, Moore's Woods and the surrounding area was a dismal swamp and a great insect problem. He hired laborers from New York City to dig ditches to drain Silver Lake, therefore drying up the woods and relieving the insect problem. Unknown to him, however, Silver Lake is spring fed. In other words, it's part of the groundwater. So that all of the water sitting under Long Island is part of it. It's a little hole in the ground, and that water is just coming to the surface. So it's impossible to drain. This attempt was known as Moore's Folly. The 200-acre or so parcel of land is today owned by the Greenport Water Authority and is used as a watershed. Paul continues in his column. A short way into the woods, we came to a huge, deep, almost stream-like ditch that would parallel our pathway most of the way through the woods. And you can see from the pictures that I took on each side how that is still there. In some place, the ditch had to be dug 8 to 10 feet down so as to guarantee that the water flows by gravity to the sea. It was dug by hand, we're told, over 100 years ago by laborers from New York City, and has stood the test of time to this day. Now again, if we look at, this is Moore's Woods, this is the main road crossing here, running along, and you can see part of that ditch runs down here through, and as it says, this drainage ditch starts in the north, flows south, eventually underneath Route 25, and it finds its way out into Pipes Cove. So that's one of the areas that George investigated for many years. This is just a map of Moore's Woods, and there's 3 ways to get into it. Number one, if you look down at the bottom of the map, just where Silvermere Road comes out onto the main road, just across the street, there's like a electrical part, and there's an area there where you can park. A second one is across the street from the Red House on the side of the road along 48 near a field just east of Queen Street and past some private houses. That's a harder one to find. And the one that's the easiest to find is behind the ball field, the polo grounds on Moore's Lane. You can actually drive in at the very end of that area and drive your car all the way in, and we would park inside all the way right next to where the woods start. So after college, George took a number of workshops and honed his skills under a master bird bander till he received his license decades ago. He connected with the Institute for Bird Populations. This is out in California, and he continued to take courses throughout his life, some of them at this particular institute. He became very involved with their program called MAPS, Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survival. He became a major part of what they were doing. This program is a collaborative, continent-wide network of hundreds of misnesting stations. Analysis of the resulting banding and demographic data provide critical information on the ecology, conservation, and management of North American land birds and the factors responsible for changes in their population. Continuing another article that Paul Stoutenberg wrote, Banding Tells Life Stories. This was in 2007. Classic picture, by the way. Here's a mist net set up. And Paul describes, during the breeding season of June and July, he, being George, has set up his mist nets in the same place and open and close them at the same time each year. He uses 9 30-foot long by 8-foot high mist nets, which are open for 6 hours, starting 10 minutes after sunrise. One of the things, I work with George doing this for a number of times. And the nice part of it is he would always say, John, you can sleep in. I'll go down and set the nets up as long as you get there as the sun is coming up. But he would beat me by a half hour or 45 minutes to set up everything. He gently lifts their feet from the entangling lines, a nail-biting task that can only be done by master bird banders certified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have to say, since they can't do anything to George at this point, that after several times, George allowed me to separate some of the birds from the mist nets. He had 9 nests, and he would start one direction, I would start the other direction. I would get to nest number 2 or 3, and he would have done 6 or 7 in the same time. Here again, you can see how the birds get entangled in the nest and are trapped. And this is a movie that explains the whole mist nest.
Today we are mist netting or banding birds, and we set up fine mesh or nylon nets along a habitat where we think birds will be crossing. And so it's set up almost like a volleyball net, and the net is so fine that birds don't see it as they're focused on one area beyond the net. The net essentially disappears. That's why they're called mist nets, because it's hard to see. The extraction process can be tricky, especially when you're just learning, but the good thing is that most birds actually end up getting captured the same way. Once you get that pattern down, it can become pretty easy for an experienced bander. The net goes around their wings and their head, and so we can carefully remove that. It's almost like taking off a cardigan. Some birds, like song sparrows, are always very squirmy and feisty. Other birds, many warblers, are very docile and seem calm, or what we would interpret as being very calm in the net. Once we safely extract or remove a bird from our mist nets, then we take it back to a central location where we have various tools and other measuring devices set up. Every bird is banded with a uniquely numbered aluminum band, and that band fits like a little bracelet around the bird's leg, and the bird is then marked for life. So anytime we recatch that bird, we know which individual it is. We then determine the species and the age and sex if possible, and we take a few measurements like the length of the wing and the length of the leg. We blow all over the birds. We're checking for a variety of things. Birds store fat in the furculum or the wishbone area, and it looks yellow compared to their pink or purplish colored skin, and so we can assess how much fat they're storing. We can look for birds in breeding conditions. If the females incubate, they get an incubation patch where they lose all of the feathers on their belly so they can warm the eggs develop. By having a bird in the hand that's marked, we get 2 very important pieces of information. One being the age of that bird, so we can see what's the ratio of young birds to adult birds, and that gives us an indication of how good the reproductive season was. Then also, because the birds are banded and they keep that band for their whole lives, we can actually look at survival of birds over time. And we can link these things to things that are going on in the natural world, big climate patterns and habitat variables.
And there's George with a nice little specimen and the little bag. The bird is just put in that little bag, and you tie it off, and you come back later and collect them all and then bring them in to be measured. This is from the Suffolk Times, a picture showing George at work, banding. It's a Swanson's thrush, which will put a leg bang on and then release. George tagged about 1,300 birds each year. In other words, trapped them, banded them, and it averaged about that number. About 14%, interestingly, were birds he had caught previously. A couple he had caught for 3 or 4 years, actually. And again, it establishes a whole nesting pattern of Moore's woods. Now, this is a close-up of the bands. They all have independent numbers, and George would have a little, this metal, structure anyway, and it has different little slots in it. And again, you could put the foot in there, but he would know by the bird immediately what size he should put on. If he didn't, he also brought along a book. And in the book, he'd say, go look up, and you'd look it up and it would say, put on a 3A. And so you would put on the proper size band. And as I said, they're all individually numbered. Again, he would carefully squeeze that together so that it would not cause any harm to the bird now or at any point in the future. So again, a very specialized tool for a very specialized band. And then we would sit and start looking at the bird itself and try to take as much information. My job is to write down what George knew, and his knowledge was vast. And he would look at a bird and say, this is 2 years old, this is 3 years old, it's a male, it's a female, all sorts of information from the courses that he had taken during his lifetime. And these are little score sheets that everybody uses across the country, and it puts down a whole series of information. Some of the data George recorded for each bird is age, sex, brood patch, presence of fat bodies. You heard her talk about those little yellow around the breastbone. Flight feather molt, flight feather wear, presence of juvenile adult flight feathers on the same bird wing, length of the wing and the weight of the bird. All of these things, most of the time you could get 8 out of 10 of them. Sometimes you just couldn't sex a bird. You couldn't tell whether it was an adult or not. But most of the time, he was able to analyze and figure out that information. Here's measuring the beak. You saw it in the movie, a brood patch. I think this is a little chickadee, and you blow on it and blow and blow, and all the side feathers go aside, and that's the patch where all the blood is brought to the surface so the eggs can be kept warm. You don't see it when the bird's flying around. Here, measuring the wing. Another wing measurement, you can see how it stretches across, and you can get an idea of what it is. Now here we're looking at, and this is a blow up of a picture that I took, and we're looking at the actual fine structure of the wing down on the bottom right. And this is a picture I got just to show types of things you might see. If you look at wing numbers 5, 6, and 7 in particular, you can see that they're ratty, they're worn, they're torn. This bird has been flying through the woods. It's been bumping into branches, doing all sorts of life activities. And these feathers are worn down, and they're getting less efficient and less efficient. So they need to be replaced each year at least. And so if we look at these top feathers, you can see that these have a completely different structure. They're new. They've just been put out there. They're able to be very, very efficient in flying. So again, you can tell by which feathers have been worn, which ones have been replaced. You can tell whether it's a first year bird, actually, a second year or a third year bird, or what season sometimes they're in. again, you can see the same kind of thing. While molt is a fascinating process in itself, molt data is most often used to determine a bird's age. Now, again, if you look at the feathers, you can see the arrows are pointing to the new feathers that are just coming out of the little tubes, and they're being extended out. And you can see some of the old feathers that need to be replaced. In general, if you look at the orange color, the primary feathers molt from the wrist out, the arrows showing they're going out. And the secondary feathers, the ones in purple, tend to go from the outside of each of toward the center of the secondary feathers. So there is a pattern that this takes place, and you can make judgments if you know what you're looking for on ages of birds and what they've been doing. Here's a case where if you look over on the left, you can see those ratty, worn out, used feathers. They've spent a year or 6 months, depending on the birds, and they're worn down. And you look over on the right, and there's beautiful, clean, new feathers. And in the middle, you can see some of them starting to come out. This is an interesting, take a look at the two arrows. I use this because you can see on the right and on the left, and you can see a distinct difference. And note the obvious differences between the primary coverts on these two great tits. The juvenile coverts are narrower, more pointed, with greener edging. So on the left, you see they're narrower, more pointed, and with greener edging, and a much more washed out base color. So again, if you found both of these birds and you looked at that particular thing, you can say, this is a bird that just hatched out this year, or brand new. And on the other way, this is an adult. Here you can see the eye color. These white throats clearly show the difference in iris color. The bird on the left is a first year, the bird on the right is an adult. Now, George would know all of this automatically. He wouldn't have to look that. I had no idea which one was adult, but he would just know from doing it over the years, but also taking a large number of courses, he was able to immediately see all of these fine details and be able to age a bird. That always amazed me completely. And this is just a great little picture. That's him holding that little bird. Now, there are three birds I'm going to talk about. One is hummingbirds. Ruby-throated hummingbirds' heart beats from 225 times per minute when the bird is at rest to more than 1,200 times per minute when it is flying. And George would not ban ruby-throated hummingbirds. He felt that they became too stressed and that he would get them out of the mist net as quickly as possible. One time though, he did, and it's just one of my life experiences, he held on, he got it out of the mist nest and told me to put my finger right on its chest. And you could hear like a machine gun. You could feel that heart just pounding, pounding, pounding. And I have a little movie of that. If you look in either the upper right or the bottom left, you can see the thumping of the heart and how quickly it's going in these. So he always felt that they got stressed too much. So he usually did not ban the hummingbirds. Second, cardinals. This is a bird that I always allowed George to take out of the net. He warned me and I took his advice and allowed him to take these out of the nest. Here you can see on the left, this cardinal has taken on this twig, sizable twig, and is pressing on it. On this right picture, you can see why you might not want to deal with a cardinal's beak. And the next picture shows why I didn't want any part of it. You can see that this was excruciating pain. So George was always good at taking cardinals out for me. And then finally, a third one was woodpeckers. Woodpeckers just, I have a picture of another one, but woodpeckers were just very difficult in that they messed the net up terribly. For some reason, they just completely fouled the net, and it would take a long time to try to free these guys. So hummingbirds, cardinals, and woodpeckers were specialties. In 2010, George's 17th consecutive year bending birds was marked by the smallest number of birds he captured. Now, the data is available if you go to the Institute for Bird Populations. I called them up when I was doing this and said, could you send me all the data that George has? And they were very happy to send the data off. And I've just picked 4 or 5 common birds, but there's a list of everything that he ever put bans on, and all of the information, whether it's one bird or 100 of them, how many were recaptured, all of that information is available from the Institute for Bird Populations. They were very, when I did, they were happy to hear that I was doing something with George's data. So this is the American robin. And this is data from 93 to 2012. And you can see, can you interpret that? Now, maybe this particular, if you draw a line, it looks like it's a fairly average, one year is better than the other. But now this data is incorporated with data from Nassau County, from Staten Island, from South Carolina. All of that is fed into the big computer and gives a bigger picture of what's happening. The Carolina wren, one of favorites of many people. And again, you can see the last year was a very, very high population. The black-capped chickadee, last 3 or 4 years, made a big, big dent into Moore's Woods. And then there were always someone that one of them showed up. You know, this was not a common bird, but he did find it. Indigo bunting, he did find these, but they were exceptions. And that was part of, you never knew what was going to be in the nets as you went around. But again, all of this was carefully documented. And he even caught a red-tailed hawk. That was a little bit of a job. I wasn't there that day, but you can imagine. George Rossum, former president of Preston's in Greenport, died at his home in Orient on Sunday, March 24th, 2013, after a long illness. He was 77 years old and he was missed by everybody. So that's a little bit about George Rossum. Now, continuing to our other naturalist, Roy Latham. This is a picture in 1912. Roy Latham was born in 1881. Now, just remember that number. When we get to the end, you'll see why. His whole life was centered in the small town of Orient, where he worked the family farmlands from spring into the winter months. This was the farmland. It's still there. In his youth, because his elders considered farm work to be more important than formal education, Roy's schooling was often limited to just the winter months when farming was finished for the season. So in most years, this amounted to only 2 or 3 months a year. Because of this, Roy set out to educate himself. Despite the lack of formal education and degrees, Roy's intense self-education in the many areas of natural science and archaeology led him to become one of the top all-around naturalists of his day, not just in 1 or 2 fields, but all of them as they pertained to the East N. Now, again, if you go to the museum, New York State Museum, and you go to their website on lichens, in the introduction, they say, thank you to the following half a dozen people. One of them is Roy Latham. If you go to their collection on bryophytes, thank you to Roy Latham. I saw a talk by Eric Lamont once, and he took out like 10 different books and opened up each book. One was on fishes of the Long Island. And he read the introduction, Roy Latham. And then he took another book out on orchids, Roy Latham. And he went through, as I say, 10 identifying, and every one of them gave him credit. John Bull's famous Birds of the New York Area. In the introduction to it, at one point, I am particularly indebted to the following, and amongst 6 or 8 names, Roy Latham. There's no way to explain how many people, professional scientists and hobbyists, that he dealt with and educated as to what is out on the North Fork and the South Fork. When Roy decided in 1969 to gift the bulk of his collections, he divided his material. To the New York State Museum in Albany, he gave a zoological collection of 10,000 birds, mammals, and fish, many mounted by his own taxidermy. He also gave them 100,000 botanical specimens, many previously unknown or unidentified, of pressed plants, fungi, mosses, lichens, algae, as well as his shell collections. Just those numbers alone. Cornell, known for its insects, entomology, Cornell, he gave his collection of over 100,000 insects that he had collected. Interestingly, he actually discovered a new species. And if you look at the name, Lidella Latham, he, since he discovered it, could give its name, genus, species. And so he had the honor to name this particular bug that no one had ever discovered before. He also discovered Latham's Eucosma, I guess it's called, moth. It's a micromoth. Again, he first identified it and he donated it to the National Museum. So all of these museums are looking for his collection. Besides the 2 organisms that he officially discovered and named himself, there are many more that have been named in honor of him. In other words, he would send samples to other people. And for instance, this lichen, somebody named it Lathami, a fish, Trachurus lathami. It's a species of fish, a jack mackerels. It had never been identified before, and the person who identified it gave Roy Latham the honor in terms of the genus species name. And this can go on and on. You see, this is a fungus. And in there, again, the species name, and here's just a list of others. There's a collection of them. My point is that his collections were unbelievable. Besides giving all of that to the Incorporated Long Island chapter of the New York State Archaeological Association, he gave 30,000 Indian artifacts unearthed from more than 50 sites on Long Island, including the unique Orient focus, which he actually discovers, that people didn't realize that it existed before him. Now, a quick history. Over on the left-hand side, Paleo-Indian is the very, very beginnings, and they're identified by what are called Clovis points. And these Clovis hunters are the ones, most people believe they came down through the land. Some people say the water, but they came down about 10, 12, 14,000 years ago. As the glaciers began to recede, they were able to travel across through Alaska, Siberia, and they came down into the United States. And the first of the so-called Clovis points were found back in 1929 in New Mexico, near a town called Clovis. So they were called Clovis points. But as this stream following that arrow, one branch ran across in front of the receding glaciers and made their way all the way over to the east coast. They would follow the giant animals. These are large Clovis points, 5, 6 inches. These people were first human beings on what is now all Long Island. We know they were here because collectors have found their most beautiful legacy, the Clovis point, a distinctive fluted stone arrowhead or spear point that dates back around 10,000 years. The first clear evidence of human activity in North America are spearheads like this. They are called Clovis points. They're all very similar. These spear tips were used to hunt large game. Interestingly, the period of Clovis people coincides with the extinction of the mammoths, the giant sloths, camels, and the giant bison in North America. In other words, the largest animals were attacked and destroyed. Those species were exterminated. Some 14 Clovis points are known to have been found on Long Island and authenticated by experts. And you can guess who discovered one of them. This is in the Southold Indian Museum, and it's part of their unique collection of artifacts of Long Island's first people. And Roy Latham found this in Greenport, a Clovis point. Now, the archaic period in the middle is when you start to get all of these different kinds of arrowheads. They're notched, they're stemmed, there's all sorts of things coming in here. But this is a period of hunter-gatherers, right? And then there's what they call a transitional period. And then finally, over on the right, continuing further, would be the woodland Indians that were present at the time. So this transitional period is a change from the archaic period to the woodland period. And one of the transitional periods has been named the Orient fishtail. And you can see the arrowhead there. And there is a couple of them. Roy Latham found dozens and dozens of them. Now, the Orient focus group was about 1300 to 1000 BC. It started, named after two unique burial sites on the North Fork. This is a whole group, but it's based on these two unique burial sites on the North Fork of Eastern Long Island and identified partially by the abundant use of stone cooking. So ceramic cooking was just starting to come in, but stone cooking was the sign of this transitional period. And then as the later period came on, ceramics became much more common. But it was also identified not just by the stone cooking pots, but also by the Orient fishtail projectile point. This is a bulletin written by Roy Latham. More notes on the stone utensils in the Orient burials. The old stone vessels of the Orient mortuary complex, when amassed in a culture, are extremely interesting and worthy of considerable study. Their abundance in the Orient culture is unique. So he's explaining this now to the world. At Orient 2, there's Orient 1, which is to the west of this, and then Orient 2 is in Browns Hills. Latham discovered the largest single terminal archaic burial feature known from the entire New England region. Within and underlying this colossal 20 by 30 by 5 foot ochre stained deposit, Latham encountered 33 caches of artifacts. So it was a burial ground. Once again, this Orient phase dates 2,700, 3,200 years ago. And this same artifact was found over Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware. So it's called the Orient Focus Group, but this group extended up into Connecticut and down into Pennsylvania and Maryland. They all had the similar characteristics. And this is a drawing of what the burial ground looked like and perhaps what was happening. This is from one of the books about native Long Island. And this is what he discovered. The Orient culture is the most remarkable for its burial ceremonialism. Large and deep pits were dug in high sand knolls in which interment of cremated bodies or of corpses in various states of disintegration on removal from a charred house were periodically interred in an elaborate mortuary ritual, which involved the use of fire, food offerings, symbolic red ochre, grave goods of various kinds, including stone pots killed by intentional breaking. In other words, they knocked a hole through the bottom or cracked it. And this is an examples of some of the things that he discovered. And then they're found in the Oyster Ponds Historical Society's collection. These are from that particular time. And you can see how there's a hole punched through them. Now, continuing, most of you are probably familiar with the Audubon Christmas bird count. And prior to the turn of the century, people engaged in a holiday tradition known as the Christmas side hunt. They would choose sides and go afield with their guns. Whoever brought in the biggest pile of feathered and furry quarry won the day. Now, this is the kind of thing that probably occurred. And if people at the time began to look at numbers, this is just a graph showing the decline. Conservation was in its beginning stages around the turn of the 20th century, and many observers and scientists were becoming concerned about declining bird populations. And you can imagine the Christmas hunt had something to do with that. So Audubon decided to change that. Beginning on Christmas Day, 1900, Frank Chapman, an early officer in the then budding Audubon, proposed a new holiday tradition, a Christmas bird census that would count birds in the holidays rather than hunt them. Many people were appalled by the mass killing of birds and embraced the Audubon proposal of counting rather than killing. So began the Christmas bird count. Now again, I'm doing this because Roy was a major part of this. Thanks to the inspiration of Frank Chapman and the enthusiasm of 27 dedicated birders, 25 Christmas bird counts were held that day. That's the first year, were held that day and tallied 89 species. Now these 25 bird counts was across the entire United States, 25 counts. So here's the first bird count in 1900. They counted 18,500 birds. They found 89 species and there were 27 participants. Orient's first bird count that's recorded. Individual birds, 780. Number of species, 21. Participants, 1. And we can guess who that was, Roy Latham. He began the count earlier, but this is the one that was first sent in. Just to give you a comparison, in 2017, in Orient, just Orient, 24,420 birds were sighted, 110 species, and 54 people in just that one circle. Next year, the numbers were a little less, but there was still 102 species and 55 different people. So it just gives you some idea of how it's changed over that period of time. So this is the Audubon Christmas count. Roy Latham first started keeping records for the Christmas count in 1900. He told me, and this is again to Paul Stoutenberg, he told me he walked all of Orient to do that count. And here's some of notes from his records. We are privileged to have some of Roy Latham's old bird count records that he sent to our Orient count when I was compiling. This is again, Paul Stoutenberg speaking. Here are a few quotes from his letters. 1972. Here is my 73rd. Now, again, remember, it started in 1900. This count was only on this farm and my sister-in-law's place in the village. I did not see the small flock of bobwhites. I know they're on the farm. 1975, very few starlings recorded on this farm. Weeks at a time when no starlings were seen. It takes us back 68 years to 1907 when the first starling was recorded on the farm. And again, here's the value of knowing that. The first starling showed up in Orient in 1907. Got just one on this count by the skin of teeth when a single starling came to the yard to drink. Just as a little trivia sideline, there's a couple of different theories on this, but basically the main thrust is in 1890, in the middle of Central Park, 60 imported starlings were released. And that happened another year. There were actually earlier ones, but this is the one that always gets the credit for it. The next year he introduced 40 more, and just 20 years later, the birds were well established along the East Coast. By 1942, they could be found across almost the entire country. And all of the starlings in the country are descendants of those first few. European starlings are now among the continent's most numerous birds. And this just gives you an idea of how it moved across the country. These are measurements as it stretched across. So again, the idea that in 1907 he saw his first one is a bit of information. 1976, it's the third time a red-shouldered hawk has been in a tree in our yard since November 1st. This hawk has history here. We settled on this farm in 1888 when I was 7 years old. Now again, 1888, he's now talking about 76, add those years up. A pair of red-shouldered hawks was nesting on this farm that year and the following years to 1912 until that grove of red cedars were cut off. This bird alighted on a tree about 30 feet from me. When this was read out, after I gave the talk, somebody in the audience got up and said, oh, by the way, it was my grandfather who cut those trees down for the farm. And she was embarrassed by it, but owned up to the fact that that was done by her family. Mr. Latham used his old 1912 Oliver typewriter to record his bird list each year on stationery that had a picture of his windmill with an osprey nest on it. His farm was called the Osprey's Nest. In one of Suffolk Times interviews with Mr. Latham in the 70s, he said, we used to see 19 fishhawk nests from the front porch. Now we see 2. Now again, this is in the 70s. We had 60 osprey nests in Orient at the peak. Now there are only 4 or 5. That's in the 70s, so you can imagine. Now, this is kind of interesting. One of his more adventurous bird trips, this is Roy Latham, one of his more adventurous bird count trips was the first count he did on Gardiner's Island in 1905. He and his brother rowed their rowboat across to the island to take the count. So again, it's 6 to 8 miles. Some of you might have taken the ferry out there on a day. They rowed a small rowboat over to Gardiner's Island to count birds in the middle of the winter. They got caught in a snowstorm and spent the night in one of the fishermen's, oops. Hello, everybody. Am I back?
Yes.
Peggy?
Yes.
All
Yes,
right.
you are.
My computer died and I have it on my other computer. So if you'll just give me 1 second, I will be able to catch up. So just be patient.
This computer died. Okay, so that's it.
Oh, you know,
There we go.
I'm sorry here. There it is. We're loading it up and I'll be able to continue. What was happening was he had rode over to
He went to Gardiner's Island.
Gardiner's Island with his brother.
To do the Christmas bird count on Gardiner's Island.
I'm getting there. Just be patient. I don't know what happened, but the computer just died. Now we're back. And this is where I left off. Woke up in the morning to find an eagle sitting on a pole outside the shack. They rode home to Orient. Now, again, if you've ever been out there, you can understand the waters. Person of the century, this is the Suffolk Times. Roy Latham, whose taxidermic collections of birds, mammals, and fish and Indian artifacts were said to represent one of the most complete pictures of Long Island wildlife and the most extensive natural history collection ever made by an individual, died in Orient Point. He was 98 years old. And that's a little bit about Roy Latham. If there are any questions that have been put up there. Peggy, do you have anything?
Hi there, I'm just looking and we're not seeing your screen for some reason. We're not.
You know why? It's a black screen.
Yeah.
The last slide is a black one. I'm here though.
Okay, now anybody is welcome to enter any questions in the chat room. So if any of you have questions, and I'd love to hear from some of the Rosum family. I know Rick Kettenberg had a comment, so you're welcome to post any comments or questions in the chat room and we'll read them and John can answer them, hopefully.
Yeah, I don't have access to the chat room myself right now, Peggy. Normally I do.
Okay, I'm seeing here. Okay, so Rick Kettenberg wrote that George studied under master birder Jim Peon in Nassau, which is where Rick's wife Linda met him many years ago. I'm looking for any questions from anybody or comments. Just put them right on the chat.
That's okay if there's nothing out there.
Oh, here's a question. Laura Luciano writes, what are the banding efforts now? That's a good question because yes, we need more bird banders out here. And of course you have to get certified and that's not easy. Do you have any?
I don't have, I don't think anybody has taken up his particular job at Moore's Woods or at Orient.
They've definitely not. And he's left such a hole that, he had so much knowledge and it would be so great if someone could continue it, but we need someone here locally to get their bird banding license. Let's see, I have some other questions here. from Carrie Rosum. Thanks for bringing back such great memories. We can verify the cardinal pain. I hope that wasn't your finger.
Yeah.
And did George and Roy work together? That's a good question. Did they ever work together?
I don't know if they worked, but they knew each other.
Huh.
I know that. I don't know if they worked.
Yeah. Huh. And yes, the recording will be available if anybody missed part of it. And any other questions, anybody? Oh, Paul has a question. He's sitting with me, my husband.
Yes. Mr. Stoutenberg, was there any interplay between the three of them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Paul was like a connection, but he was Roy Latham's disciple almost in one sense, that they dealt with each other. And then Paul also dealt with George on many occasions. Many occasions.
Yes, Paul Stoutenberg is missed, sorely missed as well. Yes, and Jennifer from Norfolk Audubon is saying we hope to restart the banding efforts. Yes, I'm hoping Jennifer will be able to get her banding license. And and then also I should have mentioned this in the beginning of the program, birding and hikes all on our website, northforkaudubon.org. We always have current program information. We do have a regular now Friday morning bird walk, the first Friday of every month with guest birders. Plus we have a whole roster of programs like these, Zoom programs and live programs. So just check our website. And if you're not on our mailing list, you can write and add your name to our mailing list by writing info@northforkaudubon.org on the website. Here's another question from Debbie O'Kane. Are there any other Indian artifacts found in Orient since Roy Latham's discoveries?
Oh, that's it. Yes, definitely. They've been literally, I don't want to get too informational, but there were other old, two little kids were found from that same time period in a burial ground on the south of the main road. So there have been other things that did occur.
How recently was that?
I think that was in the late 30s, early 40s. I think I'd have to check my notes there. But yes, there have been other things that have been found dating to that time, but not a lot. Those two areas, the Browns Hill 1, and they call it Browns Hill 2, even though the other one is like 3/4 of a mile to the west of that. Those were major discoveries. I mean, a major, there's nothing to match that area. And they've since disappeared too, by the way.
Yeah, I had no idea about that. Okay, well, that's great. If there's no other questions, Fort Korchog at Downs Farm. I guess Rick is saying that there have been some Indian artifacts found there. Okay.
Yes, that's a different time period though.
Huh. All right, well, if there's no more questions, then I think we can end our program right on time. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please do visit our website, and we really appreciate you. John, thank you so much. Great program. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next program.
Thank you, Peggy.
Lovely night. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Peggy, are you still there?
Yes.
Well done.
Did you try your program again?
Yeah, no, I haven't tried it again. I'm going to practice it tomorrow, though.
Oh, okay. If there's any question, shout.
I will. All right. Thanks, John.
All right. Good night.
Bye-bye.